applying to all human rights. The state is required to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights within a practice of self-determination, non-discrimination, gender equality, and rule of law. And how do we achieve self-determination of people's non-discrimination, of course, gender equality, and rule of law? This is a construct that in modern statecraft we understand as citizenship, exercising citizenship as a legal basis for and a common legal basis for the enjoyment of all rights. Human rights are not only limited to citizens, naturally, they're applied to all people, but citizenship provides the common basis for the enjoyment of all human rights, including political participation, and those rights that relate to housing, secure tenure, land access, ownership, a whole range of secure tenure or tenure arrangements. For economic, social, and cultural rights, there are also additional principles: the maximum of available resources, progressive realization, and international cooperation. And just focusing on the last of these, but not least, international cooperation also means that for every right of the bundle of human rights, the state has an obligation also extraterritorially in the way that it performs outside of its own borders and the way that it regulates external actors within the state. Sometimes that has an effect on housing, tenure, and of course displacement of populations when there are large development projects with external actors involved. So if we can just focus on the concept of citizenship, understanding that this is, in the modern concept of statecraft, the basis for the enjoyment of rights, that comes, that actually reflects the formula that is enshrined in the Covenant and in other human rights instruments that ensures that non-discrimination, self-determination, gender equality, and rule of law are the criteria for state performance of a treaty. The right to adequate housing has several elements, and these are enshrined also in soft law instruments. If you want to understand what is the definition of adequate housing, the general comment number 4 of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights defines that. So international law makes clear what is adequate housing. But first among the list of elements is security of tenure, which is freedom from dispossession. That is, of course, the antithesis of eviction. This formula also must include certain process rights, like rights to participation, rights to access to information, security of person, privacy, but this is actually a construct in the law that allows us to analyze whether or not housing is adequate, but one of the principal criteria for determining adequate housing is the security of tenure, whatever that tenure may be. And international law defines legal security of tenure broadly as an element, as an entitlement within the right to adequate housing. The general comment number 4, which is the source of this norm, recognizes that tenure takes a variety of forms. It's a spectrum. It can be collective, it can be individual ownership, it can be customary, it can take many forms. But also states are required, notwithstanding the type of tenure, to ensure that all persons possess a degree of secure tenure, security of tenure, that guarantees legal protection, rule of law, which should be part of their citizenship rights, against forced eviction, harassment, and other threats. And specifically for those citizens who do not have security of tenure, states are required to take immediate measures aimed at conferring legal security of tenure upon those persons and households currently lacking such protection in genuine consultation with affected persons in groups. So the state has an obligation to ensure legal security of tenure for the range of tenure arrangements that are in play within its jurisdiction to ensure adequate housing for citizens. And then we come upon the opposite of security of tenure, and that is the phenomenon of forced eviction. There's also a norm in international law that defines what is forced eviction. Forced eviction is defined since 1993 as a gross violation of human rights, in particular the right to adequate housing. So it is strictly prohibited in international law, the practice of forced evictions. This is notwithstanding, of course, evictions that take place as a necessity under the rule of law if there is prolonged non-payment for rents or other reasons or public purpose. Evictions are not absolutely prohibited in international law, but the term forced eviction is. Forced eviction is a particular term that we're referring to and using here in this context. And forced eviction as a punitive measure is also inconsistent with international law, inconsistent with the covenant. So when Egypt comes under review, like in this year, the practice of forced eviction will become a subject of that review under the covenant. And also forced eviction, even for punitive reasons, is considered to be inconsistent with international law. General comment number 7 that deals with forced eviction as a gross violation also sets out what are state obligations. States themselves must refrain from carrying out forced eviction from the aspect of the state's obligation to respect the right to adequate housing. The state has an obligation to protect, that is, to protect against the forced eviction carried out by third parties. So they should prevent forced evictions as well. And the state has an obligation to fulfill by taking steps, taking measures, including reviewing and amending legislation, rescinding legislation and or policies that are inconsistent with the requirements that protect citizens against forced eviction, and apply those provisions of the law against the perpetrators. So there should also be remedy that involves protection and prosecution against those who carry out forced eviction, whether it's agents of the state or any other third parties. And forced eviction is any practice of moving people coercively without free, prior and informed consent and without certain procedural safeguards. And these are the safeguards, that there should be always an opportunity for genuine consultation with those affected, that there should be reasonable notice given to all those affected prior to the scheduled date of eviction, that there should be timely information on the proposed evictions and also alternative purposes for planned use of the land or housing that is subject to the eviction action. There should be the presence, visible presence of the government officials on site, especially when there's a group of people being evicted. They have to take responsibility and supervise the action to ensure that it is consistent with the safeguards. All persons carrying out the eviction have to be properly identified, whether that's police or any other party. This is a legal requirement. Also, it should not be carried out in inclement weather, at night, at times when children are involved in exams or would suffer from their right to education, the human right to education. That there should be legal remedies for those who seek to appeal or seek remedy, and there should be legal aid provided by the state for those who seek redress from the courts. These safeguards are enshrined in international law, and they provide the basis for our discussion whether or not an eviction is actually legal or whether it's a violation. And the state is required to use all appropriate means to take remedial measures, and this is also a subject that is a matter of civil and political rights as well as economic, social and cultural rights. It's also important to note that the use of force in evictions is prohibited and that the state has an obligation to minimize as much as possible the use of force, and that also I mention again that forced eviction as a punitive measure as well as demolitions as a punitive measure are seen as violations of human rights, not only of the right to adequate housing, but very possibly also the international standards on the conduct, the codes of conduct for police and the basic principles on the use of force and firearms. When we hear about the cases that are arising from insecure tenure in Cairo and Delhi, we should keep all of these criteria in mind, and the role of the state, because the state is the principal duty holder in all of these cases to ensure that evictions comply with these standards, that safeguards are in place, and that there is, in fact, remedy when evictions happen. And perhaps at the end we can deal a little bit more with the remedy questions, because we can identify and diagnose the problem, but there are also international guidance principles that should help us understand what is then required of the state and what are the rights and entitlements of people who have been evicted in order that they restore their rights, and also that we deter such violent practices in the future. So with that framework, maybe I could ask if there are any questions. If there are no questions, then I'll pass it over to Gautam.